Our final presenter is Kenneth J. Yin, and the title of the presentation is Mystical Forest, Collected Poems and Short Stories of Dungan Ethnographer Ali Dzhon, right? And I know I've not done a great job at saying names today, and I know Kenneth did provide us with a cheat sheet, I guess, of some of the names in his bio, and I will do my best to follow that. All right, let me just get his bio. Right. All right, so Professor Kenneth J. Yin teaches modern languages, literatures, and linguistics in LaGuardia's Department of Education and Language Acquisition. His scholarly work centers on the, let me just make sure that I'm saying this correctly, it's Dungan, right? Yes. Literature and culture of Central Asia, as well as the Tungus literatures and cultures of North Asia, with a focus on Udej, Nane, and Evenk. He has received fellowships and awards from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Davis Center for Russian and Euro-Asian Studies at Harvard University, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and the City University of New York. He is the author of Dungan Folktales and Legends and Mystical Forest, Collected Poems and Short Stories of Dungan Ethnographer Ali Dzhon. Yes. All right. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Kenneth.
Okay. Thank you so much for the introduction. Derek, you did a wonderful job with the pronunciation.
Thank you.
I also want to thank the committee for the colloquium, for giving me and everyone else the space to make these presentations, and also mention that Ruhma Choudhury was a very valued member of the department that I'm in, Education and Language Acquisition, for many years before her passing. Okay, so I'm going to share my slides with you. And as Derek said, I'll be talking about my recent publication, Mystical Forest, Collected Poems and Short Stories of Dungan Ethnographer Ali Dzhon. So I'm going to share my screen. And here we go, slideshow. Okay, so I think everybody can see the screen now. Yes, so this was published just this year in January of 2023 by Peter Lang. And I would like to start by talking about who the Dungans are. Most people are not familiar with the Dungans. So they are descendants of the Hui, in Chinese Huizu, or the Chinese-speaking or Sinophone Muslims of China. And they are an ethno-religious group, predominantly, as I said, who are Muslim, and they number approximately 10.5 million, according to the 2011 Chinese census. And they're distributed, as you can see on the map, throughout China, and mainly in the northwestern provinces and the Central Plain, which is known as Zhongyuan in Chinese. The Hui are one of 56 ethnic groups officially recognized by the People's Republic of China, which defines the Hui to include all historically Muslim communities not included in China's other ethnic groups. So where did the Hui go, and how did they get to Central Asia? So these Hui or Dungan migrations began in the winter of 1877 to 1878 in the immediate aftermath of the failed Dungan revolt, which lasted from 1862 to 1877 under the Manchu Qing dynasty. There was and they settled, as you can see, in Kyrgyzstan, in Kazakhstan, and in Eastern Uzbekistan, primarily. The second major wave of migration took place from 1881 to 1884, following the signing of the Treaty of St. Petersburg in 1881. And then there was a third migration more recently in the first part of the 20th century, until the border between China and the Soviet Union was closed in the early 1960s. And this was following the Great Chinese Famine, which lasted from approximately 1959 to 1961. So most of these original Dungan settlers in Central Asia were poor illiterate peasants or small urban craftsmen who came from Gansu province, Shanxi province, and Xinjiang in China. So according to the latest census data available as of 2020, there are an estimated 150,000 Dungans and about 74,000 in Kyrgyzstan, slightly over 72,000 in Kazakhstan, and approximately 3,000 in Uzbekistan. So yeah, so now I'd like to speak about the main subject of the book, Ali Dzhon. He was born in 1951 and currently resides in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. He holds the rank of senior researcher in the Dungan and Chinese Studies Center of the National Academy of Sciences of the Republic of Kyrgyzstan. He also holds an honorary title as Honored Worker of Science, in Russian, Заслуженный деятель науки, of the National Academy of Sciences of the Kyrgyz Republic. So in addition to the traditional research work he has been engaged in as an ethnographer since 1978, Dzhon began pursuing creative literary modes of expression in 1969, while he was a student of literature at the Przhevalsky State Pedagogical Institute in the Kyrgyz Soviet Socialist Republic. So Dzhon's creative writing is rooted in his experiences as an ethnic Dungan in Central Asia during the Soviet and post-Soviet periods. And the writings in my book span the period from 1969 all the way through 2021. So why did I take on this project, and why is this project significant, besides being this fascinating collection of poems and short stories? Dzhon notably is a native ethnographer, in that he is an ethnic Dungan studying his own people, when the classic ethnographic paradigm has been that of the non-native ethnographer, or someone on the outside looking in and describing a people. Dzhon's literary works are also examples of what is known now as literary anthropology or anthropological poetics. So the development of literary anthropology gained momentum in the 1980s, but it originated in the pioneering work of Claude Lévi-Strauss, who you see on the screen, whose work on kinship structures in the 1940s and whose study of myth turned the attention of anthropologists to the important and neglected dimension of language. Since the mid-1980s, anthropology has become more open to literary theory and literary forms, with ethnographic poetry thus gaining increasing acceptance as a mode of representation. This is also true for related social science fields, and there has been a proliferation of experimental approaches to ethnography since the 1990s, which has led to the increasing visibility not only of ethnographic poetry, but also of ethnographic fiction, memoirs, biographies, or a pastiche of various forms. This collection also has significance for Russophone studies, or specifically the study of Russophone literature, which can be broadly defined as literature written in the Russian language by authors who do not identify as Russian, and can therefore be considered within the broader transnational and post-colonial framework that has been rapidly emerging in Russian, East European, and Eurasian literary studies. So Russophone writers like Dzhon find themselves at a distance from civic, national, or ethnic conceptions of Russianness. And finally, the publication of this volume of Dzhon's poems and short stories in the English translation represents an important contribution to Sinophone studies, as it will help to draw more global attention to the unique case presented by the Dungans in the Sinophone debate. So the relation between Chinese cultural identity and the use of Chinese written characters is a frequent topic of discussion among historians of China. The Dungans represent a unique case, as they have never used Chinese characters or sinographs to write their native language, yet they have managed in diaspora to maintain their Chineseness to a very large extent. Okay, so now I'd like to talk now specifically about the collection itself. So it begins with an introduction that is subtitled Dzhon and His Place in the Dungan Literary World. Here there is some information about Dzhon, biographical information. Dzhon on the title poem, Mystical Force, in his own words that I translated from the Russian into English. A message to readers from Dzhon, again, in my translation, and also a selected bibliography. He's an extremely prolific writer who has published more than 50 scholarly monographs and articles in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Russia, China, and Japan, in addition to 2 volumes of published Russian language poetry. So I want to take you briefly through the 10 chapters in my English language edition. The first 9 chapters are poetry, and the last is short fiction. So the first chapter, I've sort of grouped them thematically in terms of the poetry. And the first grouping in chapter 1 is titled Poems of Rumination. The second chapter I have titled Poems of Autobiographical Nature. The third chapter comprises poems about family. And among these poems are those dedicated to his wife, who is a Koryo Saram, or ethnic Korean in the post-Soviet states. And the poems also make reference to his 2 sons by his wife, who is the ethnic Korean, and also to his mother, who is interestingly an ethnic Russian. Chapter 4 comprises poems about love. And there's even a humorous poem called A Joke of Old Eros. Chapter 5 contains poems of friendship And among these is a poem titled A Tree, which is a dedication to Yasser Shivaza, who lived from 1906 to 1988. And Shivaza is considered the most celebrated poet of the Dungans. And he was also a writer of fictional prose, a linguist, a translator, and social activist during the Soviet period. But several other dedications, as you also can see, to his colleagues as well as friends. Chapter 6 comprises what I call poems of nostalgia. And these poems reference some of the many places where Dzhon has spent time in Russia, in Kazakhstan, and in Kyrgyzstan. Chapter 7 comprises poems of melancholy, and these poems include one of the earliest poems of Dzhon's, which is included in the collection. It's called Emulating Sergei Yesenin, and this particular poem was written in 1970. And as you may know, Sergei Yesenin was a famous Russian lyric poet of the Silver Age of Russian poetry, and he is one of the most popular and well-known Russian poets of the 20th century generally. Chapter 8 comprises poems of nationalistic character, and I'll just comment on one of the poems, To Dzhon Kasim. This is a poem dedicated to Dzhon's late uncle and all the veterans of the Great Patriotic War, as you can see in the subtitle, or World War II, it's better known in the West. So Dzhon Kasim was in fact the older brother of Ali Dzhon's father, and he was quite well known among the Dungans, for he was a jeweler who crafted traditional pieces. In the 1930s, he became artistic director of a professional music ensemble that performed folk tunes at the Philharmonic of the Kyrgyz Soviet Socialist Republic. He went missing in action in the battles near Stalingrad in the Great Patriotic War. Chapter 9 comprises poems of religious character, and I'll just comment very briefly on two of the poems. The poem titled Dua is about the act of supplication regarded by Muslims as a profound act of worship. And the poem Friday Prayer is about the special congregational prayer Muslims hold every Friday in the early afternoon in place of the ordinary Zuhr prayer. And finally, I would like to speak just briefly about the 10th chapter, which comprises the 4 short stories that I have rendered in English translation. So the first 3 stories that you see here, The Bicycle, Tales of Grandmother Mayan, and the last song, were previously published in Dungan translation in the Dungan newspaper, 10月的旗, translated as October Banner, and only the last story, Bitter Root, in Russian, Gorky Koryan, has neither been published in the original Russian nor been published in translation until now. And then finally, I would just like to read the title poem to you before making a few final comments. And this is a beautiful poem that I think really speaks to a lot of the thematic underpinnings of the collection. So this appears on page 20 in the collection, although it's on 2 pages in my slide. There is a mountain forest, verdant on the slopes, and high atop are dry maples. Beasts dwell there, deep are their dens. Unicorns too are to be found. Jewels are hidden in the recesses of the canyons, and wayfarers make their way, sleepless and aimless. Flowers blossom like vivid carpets. Among them dance children with innocent eyes. In dark corners, owls burst out laughing, and blackbirds peck at the hemlock. In the thicket flourish meanness and magnanimity. Together nest extravagance and penury. The lion and the rabbit share the same bed. Still there too is exceeding anguish. It roars, destroying all in its path, and gnaws at the forest called the soul. So you may be able also to see the visual pattern that I tried to replicate in my translation, which resembles a tree, as it would appear actually on a single page. And several of his poems have very interesting visual patterns, which I tried to replicate in the translations. So just a few brief comments in the minute that I have left here, that I hope that that reading the poem will give you an idea just of some of the beautiful characteristic of Dzhon's writing that include the lyric terms of phrase, the vividness of his descriptions, his keen wit, his humbleness, his genuine candor, the intensity of his emotions, his devotion to his family, his friends, and his faith, which you can see in several other poems. And last but not least, in this collection overall, his overwhelming concern for the past, present, and future of his native people, the Dungans of Central Asia. And he is truly a multifaceted individual who is at once the most important ethnographer of the Dungans and a masterful poet and fictional prose writer, which I think you will see if you get a chance to see the book. And for further information about my work on the Dungans, including my recent publication, Dungan Folktales and Legends, which was published by Peter Lang in 2021, as well as Mystical Forest, please visit my professional website on Georgetown Domains. And the URL is kjy.georgetown.domains. And thank you all so very much.
Thank you, Kenneth. I'll pass it over to Richa.
Yes, so right now we don't see a comment in the chat. Andrea has mentioned one. She's thanking you, Kenneth, for honoring Ruhma. And actually, we all really miss her. So I think Andrea is speaking for all of us here. But yeah, if there's any other question, then please feel free to ask Kenneth. Or if there's a comment, then please share it.
Kenneth, I have a question. Thank you for that interesting presentation and an interesting man. I have a question about, this must have been a mammoth project in terms of translation and labor, intellectual labor on your part. Could you speak to that a bit?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Joni. And I enjoyed your presentation so much too and learned so very much. Yes, this was a project, in fact, that I began in earnest in the summer of 2015. And that was, of course, was not published until earlier this year. And it was supported by a fellowship leave through CUNY 2019 to 2020. And I believe it was also, that was the main support. I also got support through PSC CUNY Research Award for I'm not sure for this project, but for other ongoing projects about the Dungans. But most of my correspondence with Ali Dzhon has been electronic, so mostly through email and later through text. And he's been invaluable, as you can imagine, in terms of helping me to write this edition in English, because not only to clarify points when I was trying to render the translations, but also to compose the introduction itself, you know, to have also photos included, which you will see in the introduction, working on a selected bibliography of his works. That was also a time-consuming project. But I just thought he was just so gracious, from day one when I made contact with him in 2015 and told him about my idea of writing a volume about him in English and getting his name out to the wider public beyond those who could only read Russian, let's say. And he was extremely flattered also. And I should mention that he made it very clear to me that he never wrote any of his poetry or short fiction with the intention of having it published for a wider public, anything more than really his Russian-speaking friends and perhaps colleagues. And he's posted most of these Russian language pieces, in fact, on his social media website, ok.ru. And there's actually a link to it on my website if you go to my Dungan Studies page, if you're interested in reading it in Russian. But so for him, it was really a surprise as well that somebody from far away America, as he termed it, would be interested in, not only reading his work in Russian, but actually rendering it into English. But I think it's just so important, the work that he's been doing for the reasons that I mentioned, being a native ethnographer, the contributions to both Russophone studies, Sinophone studies, and just being the leading ethnographer of the Dungans, and how you really can learn so much about the Dungans, not just by reading Dzhon's scholarly monographs, of which there are many and which are extremely interesting, but also for a lay sort of reader, that you can learn so much about them by this beautiful sort of poetry and short fiction that he's written. And I really I'm so honored that I was able to work with him, that he allowed me to bring his work to the public. And I hope I've done it justice in terms of the translation. Of course, the readers will let me know. But the initial feedback that I've heard has been positive about that. But it's been a ton of work, of course, and any book sort of is. But I've really enjoyed every step of the way. I really have to say, very honestly. And being able to honor not only Ali, Dzhon with the book, but also the Dungan people generally, and to bring their stories, not just his story, but their stories to the English-speaking public, and therefore the world. I'm just so very, very honored by that, and just so just so pleased. But thank you so much for that question, Joni. I really appreciate that.
Okay, Kenneth, then Jayashri is also typing in the chat that it's a great project that you're doing, and we all actually feel that. So I want to ask you, Kenneth, I remember even in the previous colloquia, you have presented parts of, different parts of your work. So just out of curiosity, how many years has it taken for all these research that you have been doing?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Risha. So my first project, which was published in 2021, the Dungan Folktales and Legends, I believe I also presented actually on that also, I believe, at this colloquium, as well as many other places. That project I worked on in earnest from 2005 until its publication in 2021. So that was a 16-year project, but on and off, of course. That was also supported by a CUNY fellowship or sabbatical. So let me see. And then there are two other projects that I'm working on right now at the moment. I'm working on another annotated translation of a documentary novel about the most famous Dungan prose writer, Arli Arbudu, who again is very little known outside of the former Soviet states, or outside of a Russian-speaking audience, that I would like to bring to the wider public. And that is written by a well-known female, actually, Dungan philologist. She was actually the first female candidate of philological science, Dungan female candidate of philological sciences, which is the equivalent of a PhD in the former Soviet states. So I've also been in contact with her, and I'm also working on a project documenting the emergence and development of Soviet Dungan literature.
Many congratulations on your book. I mean, it really looks nice. I really like the pictures also you had next to the poem. Very, very nice work.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that picture, by the way, was done by Ali Dzhon's son, who is also in Kyrgyzstan, and he's apparently one of the stars in terms of graphic design there. Yeah, so thank you for noting that.